Okay, hello everyone. So this week we're going to look at a bit of what's happening in the 3rd century or the 200s. And what I decided to do is to sort of put together some videos that I had made for my class on early Christianity. And so what I've done is I've sort of put them all together instead of me having to re-record something. So what we'll look at today is a man named Origen. He was an early Christian. I've given you his date, his birth around 185 and death around 253, 254. He's an important one because he has lots of interaction with the Roman government. He's also pretty interesting for what he did in terms of changing Christianity, and I realize in this lecture I probably have given you a little bit more information that you really need about Origen, but he's pretty interesting. Then I'll speak a little bit about Deuteropos and one of the earliest Christian churches ever found. And then I want to go a little bit into something called the Great Persecution, which started in the late 200s and then kept going into the early 300s. Origen got his start in Alexandria, Egypt, which is at the very top of Egypt. He was very active in the church as far as we know, and got into trouble a little bit later with his bishop because he ended up being ordained a priest in another area, so got into a little bit of trouble because of that. He has an interesting childhood. His father was a martyr. His father was killed during the reign of an emperor named Septimius Severus, and I'll show you a picture of that emperor in just a bit. Origen writes a little bit about his father in his homilies on Ezekiel 4:8, and what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. And you can see this is one of the reasons why he became a Christian and stayed a Christian through his entire life. He says, "Having a martyr as a father is no advantage to me unless I live well and bring credit to the nobility of my birth, namely to his testimony and to the confession which made him illustrious in Christ." We're also told that Origen desperately wanted to be a martyr with his father, and what his mother ended up doing is hiding his clothes, and he wouldn't go out of the house naked to become a martyr. So he ended up becoming a Christian, and then, as I said, he wrote quite a bit. This is just an image showing the Emperor Septimius Severus and a few coins. Actually, it's one coin, the front and back, down at the bottom. Okay, another bit about Origen that's kind of interesting, and we're not 100% sure if it's true, but the tradition about Origen is that he castrated himself. And he got this idea of castrating himself from the New Testament. So what I've given you here is Matthew 19:9 through Matthew 19:12. And as you read through this, pay attention to especially 19:12, where he says there have been eunuchs who have been so from birth, eunuchs who have been made by eunuchs, and eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And according to some people, this is what Origen did to himself. He made himself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And again, this is based on what the New Testament has to say. So Origen is famous in early Christianity, both during his life and certainly after, right up through the present period, because of, one, because of the number of things he wrote about, and another was the way that he examined texts. And I've given you here 4 ways that he would examine what I call a sacred text. Of course, that's the Old Testament and the New Testament. He would do something called textual criticism, which is a word that we use today, but it's what he ended up doing. He would look at a text and he would try and figure out what the original was. And the way that he did it was to look at all the different variations. And I'll talk a little bit about a work he did called the Hexapla, or the Six. And what he did was he took 6 manuscripts with the same text, put them all together, and put them side by side and tried to figure out what the original was. He thought that a better way to understand a text would be to read it out loud. This, as I put up here, it's useful for determining who is speaking. And the reason for this is in the ancient world, when you would look at a text, it would all be one line. There's no line breaks, there's no word breaks. It's just one word after the next. There's no quotation marks. for a direct quote, and so on. So he said that reading aloud would help you figure out that. He had different ways of interpreting a text. We've already talked about exegesis, which is looking outside of the text to help you figure out what was going on in the text. So he would look for the meanings of words. He'd look at the history. He would look at geography and natural sciences to make sure that what a text was saying was actually correct, and so on. And he also said that you can read text in a couple of different ways, and this fits into his interpretation of the text. One, you can be literal, meaning exactly what it says. You can read a text in a historical manner by looking at the history that sits behind it, or you can look at something called the allegorical manner. And I will show you in the next slide what I mean by this. But what he's really saying here is that texts have a literal meaning of what it says openly, and an allegorical meaning, which he sometimes called the secret message of these texts. You can also look at a text by drawing the lessons from the text. And as I put here, there's a very famous phrase, clarify Homer, the text of Homer, with Homer. So he thought you could certainly do that within the New and Old Testament. So these four ways of how Origen would read a text are very important to remember. Okay, and what I have on this particular slide is an example of allegorical reading. So this is taken from Paul, Galatians 4:22, and down to 4:26, where it says that Abraham had two sons by two women, one a slave woman and one a free. And he says, and he actually explains the allegory. So what he's doing is looking at the Old Testament and he's explaining it to Christians now. Hagar was the slave woman, and she was bearing children for slavery. And this, according to Paul, is representing the present Jerusalem or the present day people. She's in slavery with her children. But the other woman corresponds to the heavenly Jerusalem. She is free and she is our mother, meaning the church. Origen does this all the time. He looks at texts and he looks at the secret message or the allegorical message that he thinks shows up in almost every single line of the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are hundreds of works of Origen. He writes commentaries on the Bible. He writes homilies or sermons. He writes a whole bunch of texts in defense of Christianity. He writes mystical works. I'll show you one in just a bit on the first principles. I have just mentioned the hexapla, which means the six. Now again, that's where he's taking 6 manuscripts of the same text and putting them side by side and trying to figure out what they say. And then you have a very famous work of his, which you should be reading about in one of your secondary texts, Contra Celsum, or Against Celsus. So Celsus wrote a work against Christians, and Origen was sent the text, and then he wrote a response. Okay, in terms of the hexapla, this 6 manuscripts, he put one right next to each other, and he did this in his own book. Again, trying to figure out what the original text meant. So in one column, and he put these in columns. In one column, he put the Hebrew. One, he put a transliteration. Now, what that means is how the Hebrew sounds and what it would look like in the Greek alphabet. He had 3 independent translations. And then what he did was he put the Septuagint, which was the Greek Old Testament. And he put these all side by side, and then he wrote commentaries on this, again, to try and figure out what the original Hebrew would look like. Origen was highly educated, and he also understood Neoplatonism. Now, we've talked about this a few times. This is a philosophical idea that ultimately comes out of the ideas of Plato. It was sort of reborn in the 200s, 300s, makes a really big splash in early Christianity, especially when you've got early Christians using Greek philosophy to explain Christianity. Now, one of the ideas that Origen takes is this idea we talked about before, that God was wholly immaterial. So not material, not flesh, not something solid. He's totally immaterial, and Origen uses this. I mentioned at the very beginning of this that Origen got in trouble with his bishop, Demetrius. Part of this was his writings, and I'll show you an example of why he was in trouble in just a bit. But Origen ended up leaving Alexandria and going to Caesarea, where he was ordained a priest. And this ordination was done outside, obviously, of Egypt, and Demetrius didn't like it. Origen was famous enough within his own lifetime that he ended up meeting the mother of Alexander Severus, who was the emperor, Julia Mamaea, and talking to her about Christianity and things that was happening in Christianity, and the way that he explained it she really liked. I've got an awful lot of text on this particular slide. This is from a work called Periarchon, or Regarding the First Principles. And this is, again, one of the works where he's defending Christianity and trying to explain it. So think about what we've talked about in the past. So God is one. So created all things, and he's the God of the Old and New Testaments. Now Origen is writing this against the Gnostics, these people who believe that there's a big difference between the New Testament God and the Old Testament God. Christ came from the Father. He was incarnate, meaning without flesh, while he was God. He was born to a real woman. He truly suffered, truly died, and was raised to heaven, raised from the dead and went to heaven. Again, what he's arguing against are the Gnostics. And some early Christians who, like the Docetists, who believe that Christ was a ghost. For Origen, the Holy Spirit was associated, as I put up here, associated with honor and dignity. The Holy Spirit also inspired people to write. So it inspired the saints, the prophets, and the apostles. Now this is kind of interesting because early Christians tended not to write very much about the Holy Spirit. This comes more into the mind of the Christian in the 4th century of the 300s. The soul has a substance of its own, a life of its own, and it will be compensated for doing good things, or it will be punished. Another really important thing here to remember is that Origen believed that the soul had free will. Now this will become much more important in the 300s. And this is coming again out of the Gnostic idea that matter is evil. So for the Gnostics, the body was evil, and for some, they believed that you would blame the evilness for doing evil things. But Origen said that God created the human soul and then gave the human soul free will to do either good or bad. It could make the decision on its own. Origen believed that the devil actually existed and that evil powers actually existed, and that, I've talked about this before, the scriptures, the New and Old Testament, were written by the Spirit of God and have an evident or literal sense and a hidden sense. And this is mostly what this allegorical explanation comes from. Okay, in terms of one idea that got him into some trouble, certainly after his death, his reputation was sort of dragged through the mud after his death. He believed that there was a two-step process for creation. He believed that at first God created rational beings, and that all of these, every single one, fell away except for Christ. And he believed that there were three rational beings that were created. The angels, the demons, and then the souls, and these are human souls. So again, for Origen, God created all of these, and all of them fell away from God except for Christ. Then secondly, God created the world, and it's in the world that souls are allowed to redeem themselves and to become fully restored to God. So you do this on earth. Origen had an interesting idea of eschatology, and again, that's a study of the end times. So Origen believed, and this is a little unusual for some early Christians, that even the devil would be redeemed at the end of time. So all of these souls that fell away from God, including the devil, would ultimately realize that they're wrong, and they would join up with God at the very end. He also thought that there'd be no bodily resurrection. So he thought that only the souls would be let back into God, but not bodily resurrection. So that got him into a little bit of trouble later in his life. I mentioned Contra Celsum, and again, you should be reading about this in your secondary textbook on how the Romans saw the Christians. So there's a big chapter on Celsus, so make sure that you've read that. This was written against Celsus in either 248 or 249. And what's going on here is about 80 years before this, a man named Celsus wrote a book called The True Logos, or The True Word. And someone that Origen knew sent this book to him, and Origen decided to write against it. And as you've read in your book, what Origen ended up doing is not copying the whole work of Celsus, but copying fairly large chunks of it. So this is important because this text shows us how some Romans saw the Christians. So I've listed here 4 main points of attack that Celsus had written. He attacked Christianity from the Jewish point of view. So he thought Christianity was still, during this period, part of Judaism. He attacks Christianity from the Greek philosophical point of view. So he uses Greek philosophy to attack early Christianity. And again, what happens partly from this is that early Christians had to adopt Christian philosophy in terms of language to defend itself. He then refutes Christianity in detail, and if you remember from your readings, one of the things he ends up doing, and I'll show you this, is that he believes that Jesus was a magician. He did magic to get people to believe in him. And what he ends up doing, his big message, is that Christians should go back to Roman religion or paganism. And here's a bit of Against Celsus. This is from Book 1, Chapter 28. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through this. So what you can see here is that Celsus believes that Mary was unwed when she was made pregnant by a man, and she was convicted of adultery. At least this is his story. She was driven out and then found Joseph. She gave birth to Jesus, who he calls an illegitimate child, goes to Egypt, and then he learns magic there. So this is one of the things that Celsus is writing about. Some of these accusations are fairly common in early Christianity, and Origen writes against these things point by point. Towards the end of Origen's life, now I mentioned that his father was killed during a persecution by Septimius Severus. There was another fairly important persecution called the Decian persecution, named after Emperor Decius. And this happened. Decius ruled 249 to 251. Lots of people were killed during this period. Now, Origen was taken in by the authorities and tortured during this period. Now, he wasn't killed, or he didn't die from his torture, but he died a few years later from his wounds that he suffered during this persecution. So he ended up dying, not quite a martyr, which is what he would like, but sometimes he's considered to be a martyr. This last slide in this section is something called a libelli. So when these persecutions were going through, and if you look down at the bottom of this, you'll see that this is dated to the time of the Decian persecution. People had to prove that they were not Christians. And so what they ended up doing is having to swear in front of a Roman official that they were not a Christian. And after they did that, it was all written down, and they were given a certificate or a libelli saying that they sacrificed and that they were not Christians. So before you go, make sure you stop the video and read through this libelli. We actually have quite a few of these, and they're really interesting to read through. Okay, what you're looking at here on the left side of the slide is a map of Dura Europos, this Roman fort. Now, I should have given you a bigger map here, but this is right on the border of Syria and Iraq today. And this was partly, or was, Roman territory. And the Romans and the Persians had been fighting for a very long time, so Rome built a series of forts. Now, what was happening during this particular period is that the Persians were coming to invade, and the Romans started to panic because they didn't think that the fort would be able to survive. So what you have back here is the fort was built up against the Euphrates River on a very tall hill. There's a ravine here and a ravine here, and what you have is this is the way that you would enter the fort. So what the Romans ended up doing, instead of relying on their walls, they started piling up sand along the outer edge, and decided that may not be enough, because what would happen with these fights over the forts is that the Persians would start digging tunnels. And the idea is that you dig a tunnel under the fort and then set a fire by one of these pillars. that's holding up the fort walls, and then that would cause that to collapse, and then they'd be able to invade pretty quickly. So when the Romans decided that they had to build up these walls, and what they ended up doing is piling sand over the outer wall and into this first street of the fort. And that way, if they did tunnel under, which they ended up doing, and if the pillar would not totally collapse. So that's what they were hoping for. We have some really interesting archaeology of this particular fort. We know we had tunnels, and we know that the Romans dug counter tunnels to try and collapse these. Now, in the end, what happened is the Persians captured this fort, and then in the 1920s, you've got some archaeology done on here. And the most amazing thing that happened during this time is that they started digging the sand out of this first street. And what they ended up finding in this area here is, at that point, the earliest Christian church that had been discovered. And what I have here on the right side of your slide is a picture of this early Christian church. So this is pretty amazing to find at a Roman fort, because it's been thought that Christianity was outlawed. Now, we're not quite sure if this was an open building that said this is a Christian church, but it was a pretty amazing find, because again, we're talking about the 230s AD, and it's the earliest church that had been discovered. Also, some interesting stuff right next to it was a Jewish synagogue. Many of these buildings that are grayed out were temples to all these various gods and goddesses for Rome. And again, you've got the earliest Christian church, so pretty amazing. And then, as I mentioned, I do want to talk a little bit about the Great Persecution. So I'd already talked about the Manichaeans, and if you remember, the last series of slides were about this Great Persecution. So what had happened is one of the governors in Egypt sent a letter to Diocletian and complained about the Manichaeans, and he started to persecute them with his edict. This led to more persecutions against other Christians, and he issued a whole series of edicts that led to all of these persecutions. And what I have here is a fairly long text by a man named Lactantius, and he wrote a book called On the Deaths of the Persecutors. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. And what this is, it's the explanation of why the Great Persecution started. Okay, so as you can see in this, under the death of the persecutors, section 10, you've got Diocletian and Galerius, his Caesar, trying to tell what was happening in the future. So what they ended up doing is killing some animals. They would look at the liver, and what they discovered is that there were Christians nearby doing the sign of the cross on their foreheads. And this is the next slide of this. So again, what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. So what Diocletian did, and you've already read this, is that he ordered that everyone in his household and all soldiers could not be Christians. And what you also read is later, his Caesar Galerius, who becomes the emperor when Diocletian retires, he convinces Diocletian to expand the persecution empire-wide. So that's what you have here. A very important source for this time period is a man named Eusebius. And I've mentioned Eusebius before, and especially his History of the Church, where I was giving you evidence of how some of these early Christian texts are being used. Eusebius lived through the Great Persecution. And again, what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through this particular section. So what you can see here is that Diocletian issued his decree. He ordered churches to be torn down, scriptures to be destroyed, and then if anyone professes Christianity, they would have their freedom taken away. And as you can see here, what Eusebius says, there were a number of decrees in rapid succession. And what it ended up doing is it tried to force early Christians to denounce Christ. And if you remember, we talked about the Decian persecution in between 249 and 251, and this issuing of libelli. So the same thing was happening here.